We're standing here this morning, the James Goodman estate. We're standing for Kathy and Stacy, Amy and Thomas Goodman. We appreciate you coming to the sale. Been a nice rain, everything looking good, and we appreciate you coming over and paying the honor to Kathy and everybody for this sale. Some sales are very, very enjoyable and some are not. So anyhow, we're here to do the best we can for Kathy and the three children. So help yourself if you want to buy this farm.
The world of lost sinners was slain, so I'll cherish the old rugged cross.
When my nephew died suddenly, the farming communities around Bowling Green, Kentucky were stunned. The standing room only crowd which came to honor his memory was touching evidence of how much he was admired. As I filmed the gathering and listened to the old hymn, I wondered what caused this tragedy. What cross bore him down? Anger and sadness welled up inside me, and I resolved to investigate the mystery posed by his death, to follow the clues wherever they led. Little did I realize at the time that as a farmer he was far from alone in the manner of his leave-taking. Here then is the story of James Gray Goodman and the thousands of farmers like him who thought finally they had but one crop to harvest, themselves.
To the old rugged cross I will ever be true.
Well, James Gray his bloodline was so thick in farming with both grandfathers that you always hear, it gets in your blood, it's a way of life, but coming from somebody that's been there and understands that James and I were close, we talked a lot about it. He had made a remark a time or two that if I can't farm, I don't think I can do anything, which he had the education that he could do about anything he wanted to do. But James had such a goal of being kind of self-made, stay on the farm, that he just wasn't going to leave the farm.
And I said, James, you're a very proud man. And I said, your number one enemy right now will be your pride. And he said, you're exactly right. I said, you're going to worry about what everybody's going to think. You're going to worry about the obligations that you have and doing those people right. I said, you've always been a true and honest man. And when you tell somebody you're going to do something, you're going to do it or bust. But I said, pride will kill you. I said, just pure pride will kill you.
But the James that I knew, he wouldn't have done this. I don't know why that things happened the way they did. James is only 42 years old.
He toiled and he worked so hard and so long, trying to do right and never a wrong. Then on 10 of March 1995, for reasons we do not know, he took his own life. He left behind a family so dear, a list of friends both far and near. We ask God's guidance one day at a time. James Gray would too if he were here by our side. Someday we'll see him in that farmland above, where all is peace and joy and wonderful love.
Farmer suicide is more than a private individual problem. It's an international calamity. Brazil, England, Spain, India, and China all report high suicide rates among their farmers. In one province in India, more than 300 farmers killed themselves in 1998. In the United States, where farmers comprise less than 2% of the population, the problem spans mid-America.
What they discovered when we began looking at the data in Missouri was that farmers were far more likely than any other occupation group by a significant factor to take their own lives. In fact, farm suicide was very likely underreported. There were any number of, quote, hunting accidents coroners would list a hunting accident on the death certificate, or there would be very suspicious traffic accidents, or there were cases where farmers were taking a loaded grain truck to market, and the truck would mysteriously stall on a railroad crossing, and the farmer would be killed.
We realized that in Oklahoma in certain years that we had a very high percentage of suicides among Oklahoma farmers. Plus we had an increase in accidents in a 5-year span there. Some of the accidents that we know definite were intentional because of the person was trying to take his own life, but it would show up as an accident and not necessarily a farm suicide. In one instance that I know, the person turned his tractor over 3 times before he achieved what he wanted.
The general population, like in Oklahoma, is 15 per 100,000 suicide rate, and for Oklahoma farmers it's 49 per 100,000, and we thought we were the highest in the nation, but we found out that Wisconsin and Montana even have a higher suicide rate.
In the one multi-state study, the rate of suicide among farmers ranged from 42 to 58 per 100,000 in 5 north-central states. Put simply, farmers are 3 to 4 times more likely to kill themselves than the average American.
Do you know what it costs to grow your food?
Well, to be honest with you, I never gave it much thought, but so I don't really care as long as it's cheap and good.
The United States has a dual farm structure. You have about 15% of the farms producing about 85% of all the wealth, which means on balance you have 85% of the farms producing only 15% of the wealth. But when we think about American farming, we think about family farms. Now, on those very large farms that are producing a lot of wealth, those are not family farms. Those farms have a much more industrial characteristic, and we're seeing more of the wealth being created by a smaller number of farms that have this industrial farm characteristic. And this is a clear and steady trend in American farm structure.
We could think of the food system today as sort of being like an hourglass. That is, where you have thousands of growers sort of at the top, farmers as we'll call them. But that product then moves from them through the kind of the collection point. Ultimately, in this country, in the beef, for example, it moves through the narrow part of the hourglass where you have 3 firms, ConAgra, Cargill, and Iowa Beef, that slaughter 82% of the beef cattle. And then that product moves back out into the distribution system, and where we have literally millions of consumers. But those 3 firms that control that processing have a really very disproportionate amount of influence in the industry. That is, in terms of what the price of the animals will be, what quality of animals will be. A company like Cargill's in 60 countries of the world, so they're producing beef in other countries, so they move this around the world, and they basically then begin to determine where a product is going to be produced. The bottom line really is that first the adjustment took place in this country, and now we have a global thing going on. We don't need as many farmers anymore.
During the 20th century, the harder work and economic uncertainty of farming have driven upwards of 50 million Americans from the soil. Thanks to the invention of motion pictures, images of displaced farm families have become the symbol of the 1930s. But technology has had more profound effect. Chemical fertilizer and pesticides have dramatically increased crop yields. Since 1935, the per acre output for corn has jumped 400%. Meanwhile, the labor needed has declined by 70%, and chemical inputs have skyrocketed 1,800%. A continuous increase in per acre yield has kept farm commodity prices low.
If a farmer has to buy land and go in debt for it, it will not pay the interest. Cattle's down, grain's down, everything that a farmer's got to sell right now is ground, and machinery and everything he buys is extremely high. Farming situation, as far as I'm concerned, is worse than it's ever been since I can remember. There's a surplus of corn, there's a surplus of everything. So the politicians or nobody worries about the farmer because there's a surplus.
A farm crisis, if it's happening to you personally, is just as gripping and as gripping as the farm crisis in 1983 or 1986. The real and sinister part of suicide is that there isn't enough conversation about it, and people aren't communicating that there's problems. So there are suicides now, and some of the reasons are just the same as back then.
James was a good hard worker, but you know, I'd say maybe he had too much of a debt load. Too much of a debt load, and that won't work. But he was a good hard working boy.
Ricky Gray is James's cousin. Like him, a struggling young farmer.
There's probably not too many days that goes by that I don't think about him. Maybe it's just for a second, or, you know, maybe I think about him a whole lot. All right, I've put my corn crop out. And at this point, I've got, well, I raised about 350 acres of corn, and so far this year I've borrowed $90,000. Now, it's not all just to put that crop in the ground, but I have, you know, other expenses, equipment expenses. I don't know whether it's, you know, going to make normal yields or big yields, or, you know, it could come in drought and make virtually nothing. I mean, it's just one big gamble. So far, we've always been lucky and never had just a total wipeout, but we've had some bad years. As far as how much of that's personal income, I feel like at the end of the year, if I get my operating money paid back and make all my payments on equipment and land and so forth, and I break even, I feel like I've really done good. The way we survive personally is the fact that my wife works, and if she didn't work, I probably couldn't farm. Basically, the price corn's bringing now is the same price it was bringing 20 years ago. But fertilizer's up, chemicals is up every year. Today is May the 14th, and I just now sold enough corn to pay off just my operating loan from last year. I'm expecting a check in the mail today, and I'll be going to the bank this afternoon. So, you know, naturally that's been a stressful situation waiting this long to get that paid off.
And your bean crop, what?
No, it's sold and paid, and money's done gone on that. That went to pay back operating money. So actually, everything I've sold from last year so far up to this point has gone to pay off last year's operating expenses. So, like I say, from what I've got left in the bin, then it's really not mine. It'll get to go to the bank too as I get it.
The financial pressure, of course, is great, but a lot of the pressure that I'm talking about is more of maybe a subconscious type pressure that keeps building and building. You know, when you've got a family to take care of, and you've got all your crop and those things to worry about, each day is a pressure. Because you know that's your living. And when you take a man like James was, there's no question in my mind that his family was first in his life, and that's where the pressures start mounting, when things go to happening that maybe you can't control, and you get to worrying about, if you think, you know, am I going to have to do something else? Well, if this doesn't work out, what am I going to do? What is going to be my next step? And you constantly think of those type things. And it finally gets to the point to where actually the money that you're indebted to is not actually the big worry. It's your future that is your worry. and your mind is more or less, well, it's just more or less temporarily wore out from thinking of all the things that a farmer has to think about.
Just the stress of everything. You know, like I say, you put this crop out, and if it fails, then even though it probably wasn't your fault, you still feel like a failure when after you've done all this work and the crop just doesn't make it.
The farmers also are moral, they're church attending people in their community, and they have learned to control their emotions. They're stoical, and they tend to not complain a lot about the things that happen to them. And when they become angry and upset and things start to lose control for them, they experience new emotions. They experience the feeling of being out of control and being angry and wanting to be aggressive against other people. And then these negative emotions that they know they shouldn't be feeling start to bother them. They think there's something wrong with them. And so they try to clamp down on their own emotions, and this makes them even more upset and scared of themselves.
I got into debt so deep that I didn't think that nobody would help me, and I got on my mind that I might do nothing else, but there was no way out but to kill myself, and to really and truly find out why a person would do that is, I have no idea why I even was thinking that way. I'm not sure how to...
Well, you thought you were a failure.
Well, yeah, I guess. I thought, yeah.
You just thought you was a failure and
And I
couldn't
was-
go on, and
Farming with Dad. I guess I farmed with Dad for all of my life, and I was wanting to make Dad happy.
He was about to go off your rocker
Why do you think I was about to go off my rocker?
because you threatened to do something that you shouldn't do.
But what was the reason?
If I hadn't have told the banker to keep off of you, you'd have shot him.
Well,
And he did. He never bothered you anymore
but why did I think that way?
because you had no other choice to go. You didn't know where to go.
Well, that's the whole thing. Don't know where to go. Didn't know where to go. Didn't have no place to go.
And had no place to go.
You know, or did I not? It's not that I didn't have no place to go. I didn't think I had any place to go.
Where
Didn't
did you
know.
have a place to go
Well,
after they...
didn't know anything else.
You didn't know anything else.
didn't know nothing. Well, at least I didn't think I didn't know anything. You know, I thought all I knew was a dang dumb farmer. And a farmer isn't dumb by what I know.
That's what they told you.
That's what they told me. You know, you're just a farmer. And a farmer don't know nothing. But a farmer knows a lot more than anybody ever knows he knows. I found that out when I went to work.
You didn't like it, but you had to do it.
Well, that's right. This thing here doesn't solve any problems. It can't help you. It can't talk to you. And it don't solve any problems. Don't even think about it.
Find someone to talk to.
And someone to talk to.
That's, like I said, if you can't talk to your family and that, find someone that can.
When I talk with farmers who get very direct about wanting to end their life or driving their pickup off a bridge or something, I just get real direct about what does suicide mean? What does suicide mean to you, and are you that serious about it? And just get real direct about it. And I think there's a lot of people that are around folks that they're really concerned about, but they're afraid to even talk about that. And this is another thing I think that the hotline has been able to do, is to be real direct about suicide and confrontive about that. And all of a sudden the farmer is saying, my God, someone's really listening to me, and someone heard me say this.
Toll-free numbers were set up in many states during the crisis years of the mid-'80s, like this one in Kansas that's still operating.
The best thing that I feel that we have done with the hotline is we've been good listeners. We let people, we've given them a safe place for them to talk. We're on the end of a telephone, they don't have to look at us. That emotional change, I think, is the key that I've picked up while I talk with farm families.
Then the question must be, why do farmers keep farming? If farming is so continually unpredictable, so financially uncertain.
Well, I think that it's the green blood in their veins, that those of us that grow up on farms, we have learned to take care of our own problems and go on and make the best of a bad situation, and I think it's just the love of the land, and I think it's the green blood in our veins.
Agriculture is no longer a way of life, it's a business. Well, that sounds nice to the Chamber of Commerce, but the truth is agriculture is a good business because it is a way of life. Farm people want to farm. They want to live on the land. They want to be their own boss. They like getting their hands dirty. But what we have done is to say to the family farmer, well, it's all just bottom line now. You need chemicals. You need more machinery. You need high technology, you need college degrees, you need computers, you need et cetera, et cetera. They have adopted all of that, and it has driven them out of business because their prices have been held either flat or actually lower than they used to be. I'm talking even 20 years ago. And at the same time, their costs of production have gone completely out of sight. Well, you don't need a PhD in mathematics to figure that out. You're going to be squeezed out of business with that input pressure squeezed at the same time by the price pressure that you get in the marketplace. So the result is farmers are going broke. And they are, as a result, turning that into themselves. Rather than our society saying, we've caused this by our agricultural policies, by our so-called free market economy, we have caused the squeezing out. Family farmers not dying, family farm is being murdered in this country. Yet the farmers internalize it. They say, well, it must be my fault.
James had a lot of pride too, and it would have, I think, the thought of facing his friends and all, you know, having to quit farming, I don't think he could stand the thought of that. Because he was real well respected and considered a good farmer, and he was proud of that. And I think that was the biggest thing.
Across the heartland, the stories told by such widows are like verses in the same sad ballad.
Elmer had such pride. I remember a statement he made the afternoon that Dr. Wallace was here that I don't remember, it was something about, I'm a very good actor. No one knows how bad this is. I'm a very good actor. Something to those words, which I hadn't realized he'd been acting, but he had been acting for a long time, acting out that he was more in control, that things were better than they were. But yeah, I'm sure there were still words that back through there I should have heard, or I could have heard if I'd been listening closer. But none of us want to think our family's suicidal. We're going to deny that as long as we can, I'm sure. Somebody would have asked me 2 days before all this tragedy happened. Well, no, not Homer.
In Piedmont, Oklahoma, Joanne Yoel grieves for her husband. A registered nurse, Joanne thought she could recognize illness.
I don't know whether when he was talking that evening, when he went to bed, he planned to get up next morning and let's face it, just end his life. All things are like dominoes. You know, you can set them all up, but when one starts falling, the rest of them go down. And I can see now there were several dominoes in his situation. And I don't think I think his debt was his farm debt and his feeling of failure, and that he wasn't going to be able to, he couldn't possibly think about losing family land. That was the pushover, probably. His great-grandfather made the run here, and he had an interest in some of that land, and that was extremely important to him.
But most of the people in this country that don't come from farm backgrounds don't understand how land figures into the way they feel about themselves. And then if you grow up on land, you're used to it, you appreciate the sacrifices and heritages of past generations, the land even becomes more important. Then your own hard work and sweat and blood and muscle that goes into further improving the land makes it more valuable. Not only of your parents and grandparents have served the land, that you've served the land, and that the land is going to play a part in your children's future. So the land sometimes is the key for people that are in farming. If you don't have land, then in their way of mind, you've lost your future in agriculture.
Really, James never showed the emotion other than he made a remark one time, well, I wish I never went in debt for this place and stayed on Papa's place and Garland Graven and Jesse Weaver and Odell and stay right on those 4 places and that's all he could, that's all he really needed is just stay right there at home and farm. And of course he went over there and went in debt for that place, and it was a large payment, and he had to have more machinery, and he bought more machinery, and of course his debt load went up.
Every day when I come in, I throw my change in these little cups, and at the end of the year I roll it up. And even as small as that amount is, I take it to the bank and pay it on my farm loan, because I want that paid for. And when I get my land paid for, it's mine, and I don't feel like anybody can take it away from me. And it's just something about having that paid for, even though you may owe $1 million on tractors and everything else.
One of the reasons we have tried to persuade people to undertake the harder work and the greater risk of agriculture has been this effort to persuade people that there is some peculiar virtue in agriculture, in being close to the soil, and being under it at a relatively early age. There is a tendency to attribute a moral value to what has economic advantage. And if you can persuade people, including small farmers, that they have a moral situation related to their occupation, then they stay there and work, produce food, and are a valuable adjunct to the community. And perhaps by doing that, they keep food and textiles, cotton, cheaper than they otherwise would be. A common phrase was they were attached to the land. They derived a certain moral virtue from their association with the land and with hard work. And therefore, that justifies our neglect of them when they're working for a very low income.
Pride is number one.
But other professionals have pride. Doctors, lawyers, judges, they feel pride. Why is pride so self-defeating among farmers?
Well, doesn't society create it? Don't we have the great movie Oklahoma and Wheat and the Land Song, and don't we have all the movies where we look out over the horizon at the land, and the rancher and the farmer is always supposed to stand tall and strong and be honest, and maybe society created it a little bit. Maybe it's what we're told we're supposed to be.
The ideal of the farmer as honest, decent, and God-fearing was given voice by the Greek playwright Euripides 400 years before Christ. For good reason, the core of the Greek army, the well-armed and disciplined hoplite infantry, was composed of Greek farmers. Their demand for a say in peacetime government gave birth to democracy. 2,000 years later, the volunteers that made up the American Revolutionary Army were mostly farmers. A fact not lost on Thomas Jefferson, who fixed in our minds the image of the farmer's natural nobility when he wrote the following. In Europe, the lands are either cultivated or locked up against the cultivator. Manufacture must therefore be resorted to of necessity, not of choice, to support the surplus of their people. But we have an immensity of land, courting the industry of the husbandman. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. It is the focus in which he keeps alive that sacred fire, which otherwise might escape from the face of the earth.
Jefferson's a curious figure. He's a very complicated person. He was a substantial planter. He was born to wealth. He was a slave owner. But his social ideal was the relatively small-scale yeoman family farmer who was independent, wasn't beholden to anybody, was jealous of his liberty, a person who worked with nature to bring forth nature's bounty, which is another part of this sort of agrarian notion that Jefferson had of the ideal citizen. Jefferson himself, though, was a commercial farmer. He produced tobacco mainly for export. He was dependent on an unfree labor force. He was heavily in the credit markets, heavily in debt. In some ways, he looks forward as well as looking backward.
I mean, James made it through the really, the years when interest rates were so high, but I don't think we ever really recovered from that. I mean, he was really worried about, well, he couldn't make his payments. I mean, he'd have to have them redone, his loans redone, and all that paperwork. That's what he was working on, all that paperwork. And every year he'd have to go all this paperwork to get his operating money, because he'd have to borrow money to operate on all through the year and then pay it back. And I think he felt like he wasn't that they might not be going to give him the money that year.
And he was beginning to wonder, is this it? Is this going to be the end of the line for me if I can't get the money? Because no farmer is no farmer without credit. Every farmer's got to have credit. And more or less your life and your future is in the hands of your creditor. He's going to go along with you or he's not. And if he doesn't and you don't have the money, you're done as far as your next year. And I think those things had begun to enter in his mind.
He really never did try to narrow his farming operation down. I talked with him, and he said something about, I believe I'll let the Spinks place go, I believe I'll let James Jenkins' place go, and cut from 57 acres tobacco back down to about 20. And he said, I know that's what I need to do. He said, but I just don't think that can make ends meet at the end of the year.
The contradiction here is that what is rational for an individual is irrational for the group. It is rational for your nephew to have produced more given his needs. But when everyone is doing the same thing, you're overproducing, driving the prices down, so that at the aggregate level of all these smaller producers and even the larger producers of trying to produce more, is they undercut themselves. And then that leads to a winnowing out process, and the ones who get winnowed out are the ones who have high debt, the ones who have small scale, the ones who had the least investment in the land. In other words, those who rent land are the ones most vulnerable to this winnowing out process. And so you get into a treadmill of trying to constantly maximize your production through use of technologies and purchasing new technology, expanding your scale. And as long as everyone else is doing the same and demand remains relatively stable, you are constantly moving towards a target that is elusive.
One year, he won the Outstanding Young Farmer Award for Bowling Green, Warren County, JC. That was he received several awards through his life. Well, especially in school, he was really big in FFA. He received his American Farmer degree. It's the highest FFA degree that you can receive. And then after he graduated, he really didn't mean to teach, but they called him, and but he didn't like that. He wanted to be farming. He was the most miserable man that year. He served on the ASCS committee, which is the Warren County Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Committee, for 9 years. He served on that, and he really enjoyed that. He was really up on all the farm programs, and which I never did understand. He was a big part of our church. It still seems strange for him not to be there sitting by me, or up in the pulpit doing the announcements. He used to do that. And he, at one time, for several years, he was Sunday school superintendent, and he was church clerk and deacon, and then he taught Sunday school. They alternated. He taught like every third week. And he's still really missed there.
Who knows what was going on in your nephew's mind about this impending financial crisis. But, because he was religious, because he was an elected official in the farm community, he has a higher potential for having to measure to a higher standard, so that somebody else who this happens to them every day may say, big deal. I messed up financially, big deal. But for him, it probably was a big deal. I mean, he is a leader, and a leader has, is under a microscope. And it's also a self-imposed microscope. In other words, his own standards may be particularly high, given the kind of character and person that he was.
There has operated in agriculture for a very long time a myth, really a myth, of considerable independence. You're your own boss, supposedly, and people have tended to negate the fact that borrowed money does not make you completely independent, and fewer markets, you have fewer choices, and a whole host of reasons. And I think a number of these people just simply could see no other way out. They considered themselves a failure. They were unwilling to look around and realize that 600,000 other people in the 1980s were losing their land. Other farm families lost their land.
Federal Land Bank of Omaha bids $151,000.
Despite cries of protest from the crowd, in less than 2 minutes, the only way of life Norma Fetter had ever known was gone.
If there's no other bids, the sale's closed.
Right out of here.
Illegal sale. Let the corporation sign the papers.
The problems down on the farm have cost Fetter more than just a piece of land. A year ago, her husband Philip put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger.
The system convinced him that he was a failure. We know he wasn't, but the system convinced him that he was, to the point where he thought that the way out was to take his own life. That, again, is another example in my mind of how this is not just an economic problem across the country. It's a social and moral problem that's affecting every one of us.
It's very evident this afternoon, by seeing this number that's present, that James Gray Goodman had shown himself friendly to many. To many of us, it was a relationship that was as close, if not closer, than family. He was truly a friend that sticketh closer than a brother.
I first met James in the spring of 1990 at the fertilizer plant. The thing that I enjoyed most often was his sense of humor. Many times he would pull his truck into the plant and almost come through the door. Blow the horn, jump out, and say, "Boys, get busy," as he raided the Coke machine. On numerous occasions, I would meet him on Kelly Road, and he would swerve his old red Ford truck, throw up his hands, and make some face while I would pass by. And so as we are here today, let us remember that our number one and sole purpose in this life is to do as the proverbial writer said in Proverbs 3 and 5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not on thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Would you pray with me, please?
This is a little legal pad that I had in my Bible, and each night I had written down all different scriptures, like I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me. This was kind of something in that book that we were reading, told you to say these things, say that 5 times every morning and night, and say, "I believe that." And we would go over this each night, and scriptures, if God be for us, who can be against us? And then this is a page with, we wrote down his assets, his family and children and friends, and this was stuff that we would go over, and I kept it in my Bible. And the day that he killed himself, I worked that day, and when I got home, his mother called me and said she was worried she hadn't seen him all day. And of course I was feeling like he was doing better, and I said, "Oh, he's probably just out with Odell working cattle or something, She said, "Well, I wish you'd go looking for him." Said, I haven't seen him all day. And so I did. I drove around to all the different farms where he farms, and I didn't, see anything of him. And, I didn't think much of it till it got dark, and then I got a little worried myself, and I don't know why, but I went back to the closet where he kept the guns, and I looked in there, and his shotgun, the one I'd given him a shotgun for Christmas one year, and it was gone. And I didn't know what to do, but for some reason, and I can only thank God, told me to go to my Bible. And I went over to my Bible, and he had taken this notepad that we had been writing on, and he wrote us a note, and it said, "Dear Kathy, Stacy, Amy, and Thomas, I'm so sorry, but I can't take the pressure any longer. I hope you will understand and go on with your lives. I love each of you very much. I'll be over in the field with the cows. Love, James, Dad." He just looked so lonely, just sitting there at the bottom of that tree. And people say, "Why did you get mad at him?" But I didn't. I never. Well, I have maybe since then a few times. But for a long time I never, could feel mad at him, because I felt so sorry. Because I knew what, he was in such pain. So worried. It's really hard to see somebody you love worry so and not be able to do anything to help them.
People don't become suicidal at the first crisis they have in their life, usually. Usually they have repeated crises.
In fact, it may even seem somewhat casual or incidental at the time they actually do it. There may not be a whole lot of turmoil in their life at the time, or even an obvious crisis. It may just be an accumulation of factors. Like I use the notion of a scale tipper, where if you're in equilibrium, you're not suicidal. These things may slowly tip the scale, so that at the time when it actually tips towards suicide, the actual feather, proverbial feather that tipped the scale, may seem kind of trivial. But it's the suicidal career, or the accumulation of what I call developmental debits, that is, negative life events and stresses and traumas that kind of add up. And these tend to wax and wane. I mean, if you get into trouble, often you get help. You may get medication. Suppose you get, I don't know, Prozac, Deseron, some sort of antidepressant medication. You may actually return to equilibrium.
We thought he was getting better. When he was at the worst, I had to just beg a psychiatrist to see him because they were all booked up. And he had had a bout of depression like 15 years before that, which didn't last very long at all. On James's 40th birthday, I tried to have a special day for him. He liked a good joke, so I had a party here with about 40 or so people. He would always say, well, I know worrying doesn't do any good. He said, I've been through that, and he would talk to friends of his and give them pep talks and stuff. But then, it just really got him.
I thought sure Candy would spend a little more on me.
James had this feeling that your worth was how much you were worth, money-wise. And he was a very responsible person. Of course you wonder, you think, well, if you hadn't had any life insurance, would he have done this? Would he have, realized his family wouldn't be taken care of, where he knew that we would be because of the life insurance. And I know I told somebody, I said, well, I'm thankful for it, but in a way, you almost hate it because, you feel like, maybe that did have something to do with him feeling like he could go on and do that.
There's a lot about religious extremism that may be suicidal. Many people point out that what Christ did was calculated to get himself a public execution. So it was, in effect, a disguised suicide. I'm going to die for a cause. I'm going to sacrifice myself for a higher good. Jesus said, I'm going to sacrifice myself to atone for your sins. And I think many Christian people believe that they're doing this. But I don't think it's ever quite that simple. I think that some Christian people suicide to atone for their own sins. In other words, they've transgressed in some way. They have been financially irresponsible. They have not been a good provider. There's a lot of pressure, particularly on males in America, to be a breadwinner, take care of his kids and his wife and his family and his property.
You think you're alone. You always think you're alone. And I thought I was the only one that was having them kind of problems. I, didn't know that there was thousands of people out there having the exact same problems that I was having. I didn't know that there was other farmers within a mile of me going broke, and it was happening that way.
And he just sat there. He wouldn't go to 4-H meetings or nothing. And they said that's one thing he had to get involved in, was get back into the community, get back into 4-H, get back into doing, because it was just one of those things that happened. So, find someone to talk to, that's the main thing. So it is.
The reason I sold out is because the bank closed me out, and I had to have a way of paying back, or try to pay back, as much as I could get paid back.
See how good a bank can be. They sold him a $100,000 life insurance and didn't have a thing to make a payment with. That's what kind of a bank they were. Forced it on him.
That's the whole thing, you know. They forced me into having because I owed so much money, to having a $100,000 life insurance policy, and the $100,000 life insurance policy, I don't even know what the heck kind it was, but it cost me $1,200 a year, and I didn't even have any money to pay that for. But see, they were worried about their own pocketbook. They weren't worried about me. You know, and then you start spending money like that, and where it keeps going out and it never does come back in, you ain't got a chance. You ain't got a chance in all God's creation to make it better. And then it gets worse. Then after it starts getting worse, then you just get deeper and deeper in debt, and finally there's no way out. At least you don't think there's no way out.
And I remember James telling me that, he said, Steve, if you ever see me back up here in this hospital, he said, it sure won't be because of my nerves. I'm not going to worry about this thing anymore. He said, it's not worth it. He said, I'll be sick if you see me back in this hospital. He said, it won't be worrying over his farm anymore. He used to raise Paul County's tobacco, and we was up there in that barn one day, and he said, you know, I just wonder what would make a man, you know, sit down here and take his own life. You know, he must have had a lot on his mind, or looked like he could have got some help or something like that. I know in James's situation that probably in his mind it was a lot worse than what the real situation was.
The clues to James's death point in many directions, but in this whodunit, more than one cause may indeed be responsible. As you will discover, perhaps the most dangerous suspects are the least visible. In an investigation of injury deaths among Kentucky farmers, Loran Stallings found that farmers here in the mid-'80s committed suicide at a rate 4 times the national average. She offers a theory why.
There are a number of theories related to what causes people to commit suicide. Many of them are related to economic circumstances. Some of them are related to underlying depression. And for the farming population, because of their exposure to certain farm chemicals, which may induce depression and anxiety and inability to concentrate, therefore making farming an extremely difficult occupation for people, I was quite concerned that perhaps the exposure to some of those chemicals may also be related to a high risk of suicide. In studies that we've done here in Colorado, the suicide rate among Colorado farmers is actually lower than for the general population, and is lower than other rural residents, and is quite a bit lower than the suicide rates that we saw in Kentucky. So there may well be some very different things operating, driving the suicide risk between states. In Colorado, the farms are quite large. The average size of a farm is about 1,200 acres compared to 130 acres in Kentucky, so the economic base is better here. They may be more likely to hire it out to professional applicators. I think that's consistent with the notion that carbamates and organophosphates, which are the particular kind of pesticides that you might be concerned with causing neurobehavioral problems, would be more likely to be the levels of exposure would be higher in the Kentucky farmers. They tend to use different application practices. They're in much closer contact with the compounds that they do apply to tobacco. So the risk of exposure is likely to be higher in Kentucky than in Colorado.
The brain and the nervous system work by chemical transmission. That is, the nerve cells are very close to one another, but when they communicate with one another, they do it through means of chemicals. So a nerve cell will secrete a chemical, the chemical will move to the next nerve cell and cause it to fire, cause it to delay fire, modify its action in some way. One of the most important chemicals is acetylcholine, the chemical that we make. And this chemical is critical in muscle contraction, both the voluntary muscle contraction as we play the piano or chop down a tree or wave our arms about. The pesticides, the organophosphate pesticides, work
because they interfere with that enzyme that breaks down our own acetylcholine. That breaking down, degrading, controlling aspect is lost if we're exposed to the pesticides, because the pesticides bind to the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine and cause us, in essence, to become overdosed with our own acetylcholine.
Well, it's also important as a neurotransmitter, right?
Yeah, that's right. It is a neurotransmitter. It transmits both in the peripheral musculature I've talked about, but it's also important as a neurotransmitter. It has a great deal to do with brain function, although it's a little unclear exactly how it integrates with other systems. We make many neurotransmitters. We have areas in the brain where cells that respond to 9, 10, 11, 12 neurotransmitters are. So then there's this intricate balance, and it has to do with a variety of things, including mood, behavior, perception of the world, consciousness.
40 years ago, Australian doctors discovered that continuous exposure to organophosphate pesticides could lead to severe psychiatric problems. In one study, 16 different individuals with exposure histories of as long as 10 years to as short as 18 months had many of the same problems, ranging from headaches and difficulty concentrating to depression and outright schizophrenia. In study after study since, the damaging effects of organophosphate insecticides on the human nervous system have been documented again and again. From diminished sense of touch to severe personality changes, effects are now known to last for years.
James was overweight, but the doctor told him, he said, to be overweight, you're the healthiest man I ever saw. I mean, he really, the only thing, I think his bad cholesterol was kind of high, but other than that, I mean, his blood pressure, everything was really good. And James was really a strong man. He did, you know, a lot of physical labor. And even though he was big, he was in pretty good shape.
Do you ever recall, I know if you raise that much tobacco, you have to do a lot of spraying.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever recall him complaining about it?
Yes, now a few times when he would say, you know, if he'd been spraying all day or something, of course he did a little custom spraying, but mainly just his own, which was a lot in itself because, you know, he didn't just spray tobacco, he sprayed some other crops too, but he would say he would feel bad, you know, that night or the next day after spraying a lot. And
were there other symptoms like insomnia? Did you ever notice him having like a summer flu or something?
I can't recall. Of course, he said he hadn't slept good, but
right.
You know, no, I think with him it was more just he just felt bad. I don't know. He may have had headaches. And it seemed like one time he told me his hands were numb.
If you came to me, say as an occupational health physician or somebody who practices in an agricultural community, I would ask you, what kinds of chemicals have you been playing around with? This is a big problem, you know, in industrial medicine. The first indication of any toxic effects from ketone, which is an organochlorine, was nervousness. Now here you have a bunch of workers who are exposed to ketone in a crummy environment, I must say. And somebody comes to the plant physician and says, Doc, I've been feeling nervous lately. I don't know what's the matter with me. So the first thing you would think of would be, well, how are things with your wife, with your family, with your boss, right? And I think unless you have a lot of experience or are primed to think about exposures, you wouldn't. Because the symptoms, the complaints, are so nonspecific, so vague, and so much a part of our everyday lives.
So if a farmer had these symptoms of nervousness, perhaps a flu symptoms, you think it could be easily overlooked as a chemical exposure?
I think it could be very easily overlooked because most physicians are not trained to think in terms of toxic exposures.
Now, he had headaches, but of course if he wasn't sleeping good, that can cause that too. I know he took Goody's headache powders a lot.
And there's a whole list here. Let me read some more. Memory loss or trouble concentrating.
When he had that toward the end, but I think that was depression.
Depression is so common. It's difficult to take an individual patient, an individual person, and make a diagnosis on the basis of something as vague. It's very difficult unless you have good chemical evidence, good exposure evidence, to connect it to toxicity.
At the University of North Carolina, experiments by Dr. David Overstreet have confirmed an association between pesticide exposure and changes in the brain's chemistry. So this is a member of the sensitive line, which is the more depressed, so I'm going to put him in the swim tank. He'll do a bit of swimming. They have high levels of serotonin in the brain areas, which means that it's not being released as much, and serotonin decrease is associated with depression, as we find in these animals. Great care should be used when applying pesticides in the area. Don't just say, it can't happen to me. Wear protective gloves, protective everything, because you don't know how dangerous those things are. And a key point that's occurring both in animal and human studies is that low-level exposure can occur where you don't see anything. Nothing happens. Then all of a sudden, a couple of months down the line, you're beginning to experience memory problems or concentration problems, and you don't know why. That's possibly because low-level exposure, you weren't taking good care of yourself. These compounds have irreversible effects on the enzyme. So if you have a little bit here, the next day you have a little bit more, the next day you have a little bit more, your enzyme is keeping going down. So at a point where you don't see any what we call acute effects, there's no flushing or sweating or anything, all of a sudden you start having problems with your concentration. And you may think that that something's wrong with you, i.e. you may begin to think you have a mental disorder.
There was a clue that I didn't pick up on. It was very interesting. He'd been in Oklahoma City, which we were raised close to Oklahoma City. We knew every street there. There's just like you would know where your bedroom is at night. And he came home from the city and he said, a street that we're very familiar with, he said, I got lost today. And I didn't know where I was for a minute. And he was on a street that we were very familiar with. And I said, oh, really? We just kind of laughed it off. But there was a clue. That was a real stressful clue.
Of course, James had tied ropes, you know, since he was a little boy, tied knots. I know they were, he'd sold a load of hay and he was up there trying to tie the rope and he forgot how. I think Odell had to go up there. That was when he was so depressed. You know, he couldn't remember how to do it.
What can potentially happen is the thing may feed upon itself. You begin to have problems, you become frustrated at having those problems, which then gives you stress, which then makes your problem worse. That's the other thing, is that acetylcholine, which is this neurotransmitter, that would tend to go up with chronic exposure to the pesticides. That's a key transmitter underlying stress responses. And so that if you are having problems and now you perceive those problems as stress, then the acetylcholine is going to go up even more. There's less enzyme to take care of it. This can exacerbate your memory problems. You might get behavioral depression as well. Feel unable to cope with things. The problem is that when you do a selective breeding study, you may get other changes besides what you are intending to get. And we've got these changes in serotonin, but we don't know whether that's because of its relationship to acetylcholine or whether it's just chance. We don't know yet. We've actually done some breeding where we bred animals for serotonin differences, and lo and behold, they also have cholinergic differences. So we think the two systems are tied together in some way. That's a phenomenon that you normally see when you give them a cholinergic drug. It's called chromodiarrhea. It's red tears, and it occurs from cholinergic sensitivity. Now, if this animal was stressed from the water, his cholinergic system was activated, and he got red tears. So now he's depressed, as it were.
The major biological trait of suicides is that they have low levels of serotonin in their central spinal fluid, in their brain, in their blood. That alone would tend to make you vulnerable to suicide, completely apart from social and individual factors. In other words, how you were raised and so on. If you had that biological constitution, that would make you vulnerable. So biological stuff is really important. And the other thing is that often it's easier to change the biology than it is to change the society. So for example, you may say, well, how do we change the farm economy? Difficult. But people can take Deserol. People can take Prozac. People can take Effexor. These are all antidepressant medications. So you can change the individual's biology maybe, even though it's more difficult to change the economy.
I really feel like the medicine that the psychiatrist put him on went against him. James got really nervous after he put him on this medicine, and he wasn't sleeping any better. And I called the psychiatrist maybe 2 different times and told him, that it was making him really nervous. Well, instead of, taking him off that and trying something else, he would tell him to increase it.
Hopelessness and depression don't have a lot of energy to them. I mean, you think of somebody who's really depressed, they may be bedridden. They may not be able to get up and go to work or get dressed. But that's not what a suicide is like. A suicide has to have enough energy, enough anger, and enough violent behavior to do something that's pretty dramatic. Otherwise, you would just sort of lie around and waste away.
Like I said, we thought he was doing better. But then, since then, I've read that that's usually when it happens. When a depressed person is at their worst, they're not capable of killing themselves. It's when they start getting a little stronger and a little better that they have the ability to go through with it.
So the psychiatrist or his doctor, nobody briefed you on any of this beforehand?
Mm-mm. No, I didn't even speak to the psychiatrist. I mean, James went in and talked to him. He prescribed him medicine.
And one of the things we talk about in treatment of suicides, you've got to be careful when you treat a suicide. Because, for example, if you give somebody something like Deserol, they often will get highly agitated and highly energized. And so as they're getting better, you paradoxically increase their suicide potential. Because now there's a lag effect between what the antidepressant medications do is they energize you before they get rid of your suicide ideas. As you energize a person in treatment, as you make them feel better, you in fact make them at greater risk for suicide.
I think that's maybe another factor in his suicide. I just really feel like he was on the wrong medicine too. Or it was really going against him. I don't know why the doctor didn't think that. Or
how long had he been on medication?
maybe 3 weeks to a month. It wasn't real long.
We're in there messing around. I don't want to be too critical, but we're in there modifying chemicals in the brains of depressed and agitated and drug-using people in hopes of doing them some good, and sometimes indeed we do them some harm because we're just clumsy and we don't have good enough tools yet.
Thousands of studies have examined suicide in hundreds of ways. In one of the first studies of suicide by occupation, a particular category of farmers topped the list. Social stress and isolation, speculated the author, may have pushed sheep herders and wool workers toward their own destruction. But new evidence from the United Kingdom suggests another explanation.
What this map shows is that the suicide rates are particularly raised in the highland areas of Scotland and also in the major cities Aberdeen, Dundee and Edinburgh. Interestingly, the rates are not raised in Glasgow, which is the city most commonly associated with social deprivation. The communities in which suicide rates are raised are the rural communities, where the predominant industries are sheep farming, whiskey making and tourism. And it's interesting to contrast those areas with the areas around Aberdeen, which are also farming areas. Here the farming is predominantly of beef cattle, and there's a clear distinction between those farming areas where it's beef cattle, which have low suicide rates, and the farming areas where it's sheep, where the suicide rates are much higher. In Scotland we have this major change from the Highlands being an area of low suicide rates in the early part of the century to now being the area with the highest rate, substantially higher than anywhere else in Scotland. Some of these communities have suicide rates which are 50 to 60% higher than the national average. The question then is, what's happening in those rural communities?
One thing that's happening is that twice a year shepherds in the British Isles dip their sheep in organophosphate pesticide to rid their wool of annoying insects.
When I think back historically, I realise that each time we dip sheep, I had what they call dipper's flu, which involves a feeling flu-like, feverish, tight chest and a cough and a runny nose. And that disappears after about 24 hours. And then in the summer dipping in 1989, I got some sheep dip accidentally in my boot, about a teacupful. And instead of removing my clothing and washing my skin and putting on clean clothing, I carried on dipping because I didn't know to do any different. By that afternoon, I was feeling really very unwell and couldn't cope with work for that afternoon. And I got better after a couple of days. And then about 3 weeks after that, I suddenly became terribly, terribly fatigued. I got up in the morning and had to go back to bed, and I was sleeping, about 12 months after that, I was sleeping nearly 20 hours a day. I would do a little bit of work and then feel terribly tired. And various other symptoms developed, muscular symptoms and pains in the bones. And the worst ones, I think, were probably the neuropsychological ones, because my family couldn't understand me. My moods would swing violently, one way and another. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't remember what I'd been told. If I tried to read something, I'd read a paragraph several times over before it sunk in. My short-term memory was appalling, and yet my long-term memory was still intact. I had no problem with that. What I wanted to say didn't come out of my mouth. My brain would think one thing and my mouth would do another. And the frustration of having been physically very, very fit, to suddenly find yourself exhausted all the time, and the inability to articulate what you were feeling and what was going on was terribly, terribly confusing. And there were occasions when I would find myself standing under a tree with a shotgun under my chin. No feelings of anger or depression or anything like that. Just that I don't want to be here anymore. And then 10 minutes later it would be gone. And I still occasionally get these feelings, but because I know what the cause of them is, in other words, it's organophosphate poisoning, I can push them to the back of my mind and get on with something else.
An ordinary farmer by all appearances, this lady is nevertheless a peer of the realm, the Countess of Mar, with a seat in England's upper house of Parliament, a position she has used to tell of the dangers of organophosphates. A story now being told in British medical journals as well as the popular press. Repeated exposure to organophosphate-based pesticides appears to be associated with subtle changes in the nervous system, notes one English report, which concludes, sheep farmers appear to have a greater vulnerability to psychiatric disorder, a condition one psychiatrist defines as a new disease.
Our studies indicate that roughly 50% of patients that we've diagnosed as suffering from organophosphate exposure experience significant suicidal thinking. And we haven't got figures on the number that actually make an attempt. Now, this is much higher than one would expect in a normal population.
Bob Davis, chief psychiatrist at a mental hospital in southwest England, cautions that pesticide-poisoned patients can respond to antidepressant medication strangely.
We tried low doses of drugs like Prozac. Now, we haven't been able to do any controlled trials, but we find that in a proportion at least, these will even out the mood swings. But I must emphasize that these are low doses, 4 to 8 milligrams a day, as opposed to 20 to 40 a day, which one would use in depression. The reason for this is that many, but not all patients, become very ill on standard therapeutic doses of this drug.
Dr. Davis continues his explanation by describing the side effects of these medications which characterize this illness.
It's basically a major exacerbation of the side effects which these drugs have in other people. A proportion of people, for example, feel quite sick when taking these drugs. Patients with organophosphate toxicity become violently ill in that respect. They also experience difficulties with coordination, and there are cases on record of other ordinary people without this problem having muscular problems, but it's much more frequent and much more intense with organophosphate poison patients.
Experiments to discover why so many Gulf War veterans are ill have revealed that more organophosphates reach the brain during periods of stress. Placed under stress, lab animals absorb the organophosphate tested into their brains at concentrations 100 times greater than normal.
And under that stress, pyridostigmine gets into the brain 100-fold more effectively into the mouse brain than it does under non-stress conditions.
Experiments in Dr. Surek's lab have shown how organophosphates alter the genetic code of the brain's cells, creating long-lasting changes inside our minds.
Transgenic mice look normal in their dendrites, but at the age of 7 months, half a year later, they lost a lot of their dendrites, saying that the neuronal network might have been damaged. So what we're talking about begins with a very fast hyperexcitation in the cholinergic synapse and ends with a progressive long-lasting changes even in the structure of the brain, not only its function. And it can happen not only to those patients who were subject to an acute traumatic event at the psychological level, but also to those that were exposed to insecticides.
5 years of experiments by Warren Porter at the University of Wisconsin have disclosed an array of damaging health effects from exposure to farm chemicals.
What we have decided to do is to focus on what are the primary, most abundant, likely chemicals out there that people are going to be exposed to, especially in mixtures, and then explore what happens if you expose them under natural routes of exposure, not jabbing them with a needle, but giving it to them in their drinking water, or giving it to them in their food, or contacting it by their skin, these kinds of things.
And you discovered what?
We discovered that we were seeing changes in aggression levels, we were seeing changes in learning abilities, We were seeing changes in their immune system, a suppression of immune parameters. We were seeing changes in their hormone levels. We were seeing changes in the chemicals in the brain that are responsible for the transmission of impulses from one nerve to the next. And those changes in the brain were principally in the memory and the motor coordination centers of the brain. When you have a pesticide which has been designed to get into a cell and to attack with a strong electrical charge, what you have in effect is a molecular bull in a china shop. The possibilities for effects are endless. It can happen at the developmental stage of a fetus, as the fetus is trying to decide, am I going to be male or female in my genitalia? It can happen in another part of the development when the brain is forming, the folds are coming up to make the brain, and the brain is trying to decide, how am I going to form? The whole cascade of events there can be modulated by just the slightest shifts in hormone levels that can be induced by very small amounts of pesticides, especially in mixtures.
And in fact, we're finding that you can't treat chemical poisoning with chemicals. And a lot of the drugs don't react in the same way with an OP poisoned person as they would with a so-called normal person. And we've got a prime example of this. There was a young man up in Yorkshire, a 31-year-old. He'd been exposed to sheep dip when he was young. He wasn't clinically depressed, but he suffered from chronic fatigue and he had mood swings. And the psychiatrist who was looking after him was running a clinical trial with a drug called galantamine. Galantamine it acts on the cholinesterase in the same way as organophosphates do. And this young man, after taking the drug for a month or 6 weeks, committed suicide by taking strychnine. And the saddest thing about that is that he wasn't dead when his relatives found him. By the time they found him, his mood swing, which had caused him to take the strychnine in the first place, had passed, and he wanted to be saved. But the strychnine was no saving him.
The medication and all that James might have been on had a lot to do with that was steering him in kind of which way to go. He'd have his good days and his bad days. He told me one day, he said I was there by myself, and he said, you know, if anybody had been there, he said, I just, you know, I broke down, had one of the awfulest fits that I'd ever had in my life, there by myself. He said, this pressure is getting so strong. And he said, but then the next day, I'd feel better. I think my things are going to be okay. I'm going to pick up and go on. He was kind of just on a roller coaster there that he didn't know which direction to go.
To me, the farmers really get somewhere in life by being single-minded, hard workers, perfectionists. They pay attention to detail, and they stick it out. They're persistent, and these qualities serve them well. But during a time of crisis, these same qualities can be flaws or fatal flaws.
We can give reasonable mechanisms whereby OPs produce directly mood swings, concentration impairment, and so on. So I think using these psychological explanations is a bit like using magic. There are good biological reasons to suppose that organophosphates will produce these results directly. In this country also, of course, the official line is that farmers get depressed and kill themselves because of the European community, the bureaucracy, and so on, and isolation. And I'm sure that these do play a part, but it's not the whole story.
Studying human behavior is difficult. Studying the biochemical interactions is difficult. And then when you superimpose on that drug interactions with the biochemical interactions of the compounds that you're interested in, we know virtually nothing about those things. We need to know more. There are people who are trying, but it is very slow and time-consuming and costly.
And I think doctors have got to be very, very careful before they put a label on a patient. Especially nowadays when we don't know what chemicals we're using, what the synergies are between chemicals, how one chemical on its own may not be very poisonous, but how two together can be incredibly so.
I just feel like it was several factors together that caused, I don't think it was any one particular thing, but I think it was just kind of, you know, built up all these different things that happened to him or were happening to him.
We're treated as units. You might be a work unit, therefore you're a cost that they can't afford, so cheaper to go to China or Vietnam or Indonesia. Or you're a consumption unit. You got to get out there and buy. Increasingly, we're led to think of ourselves as units, capable of being manipulated chemically by the whole biotech industry. We're told to take mood-altering drugs. Never mind whether you might have a reaction to the medicine, that it might be bad for you. You're the guinea pig. We become a little chemical factory ourselves. This has already happened in agriculture. We were told to treat plants and animals that way. So it's not a very long leap from the way we're told to treat others to the fact that now we're being treated the same way.